Right, so today I'm going to be talking about something that's kind of a compilation of a lot of the work I've done over the past several years, thinking about algorithmic fairness in criminal justice settings, particularly in the United States, but I think some of the sort of like general principles and ideas are more broadly applicable. And so the idea of what I want to do today is talk to you all about some different ways to think about how a model might behave fairly and how it might support maybe something that's maybe a broader concept like justice, how it might contribute to a better society by thinking through some of the different considerations and sort of different layers you might want to consider when you're thinking about fairness. And like I said, and like Shana said, I've been working in the criminal justice setting for the last several years, thinking about the models that are used there. So I'm going to choose one running example that to illustrate some of these ideas that ties into some of my past work over the last several years. And that example is risk assessment models. We'll give you a very quick overview of what I mean by that so that we can, so that I don't have to reintroduce it every time I start talking about it. So risk assessment models are actually used throughout the criminal justice system, but I'm in particular have been thinking about pretrial risk assessment models. And typically what these look like are, if I were to give sort of a cartoon picture of it, it would look something like this. You have some sort of input data, it usually is something like criminal history, sometimes demographic information like gender, and sometimes interview questions, the answers to various interview questions. And those will go into some kind of model. Here, it's sort of a gray box here. Typically, you actually can't understand them, so I don't mean through this slide to imply that it's completely inscrutable or anything like that. But there's just some sort of model, and out the other side comes some sort of recommendation based on the prediction. So usually, what these models are predicting are things like whether a person will fail to appear for a court appointment if they're released, or whether they will be rearrested at some point, usually during the pretrial period in the cases that I'm looking at. And then those sorts of predictions are compiled in some way to make some type of recommendation. So, oops, whoa, this slide is not what I intended. Okay, and so it would look something like this, right? So you'd end up with mapping some of those predictions, maybe the prediction for failure to appear here, seen on the left on the vertical axis, or a prediction for whether someone will be rearrested on the horizontal axis, and those would map to these different colors, which would be something like green, just let the person go, up to red, release not recommended. And the things in the middle would be something like release them, but with some sort of conditions. And so these are the sorts of models that I'll be talking about today. Typically, they are, at least at their core, based on statistical models. They're built by some sort of data science process. And so I think these are really, one, highly impactful on people's lives, and two, good illustrations of things we should think about as data scientists when we think about creating models to behave fairly and to support justice and better society. All right, and so some of the layers I'm going to be talking about today are already shown on this bullseye here. But the first layer I want to talk about is thinking about the model in isolation. All right, so if you've been following sort of a lot of the algorithmic fairness work that's been going on for the last 6, 7, 8 years or so, that's largely been conversations largely, I think, been taking place within machine learning, but it's grown elsewhere as well. People often think about the fairness of the model in terms of the model just by itself. And what many people's entree to this sort of approach to thinking about model fairness came from this article published in 2016. It was published by ProPublica, so it's just a news article, but it's had this huge impact in academia, in which they claimed that one of these types of models, not one used in pretrial, but a similar model that's used across the country to predict future criminals, is biased against Blacks. Their words up there at the top. And this assertion was largely based on the observation that the false positive rate, which is shown in this red box here, was about twice for African Americans as it was for white people. And so this, again, got a lot of attention and spurred a whole lot of research in the machine learning and algorithmic fairness community about how to build models that don't have this property. All right, and so how people often think about fairness when they're thinking about the model in isolation is very similar to what we saw there. So it's essentially taking some sort of model performance metric, calculating on each different group separately. So in this case, they are calculating it for white people and for African American people, and then comparing those metrics and seeing if they're the same. So in that case, in this case here, they're saying, hey, the false positive rates are different between the two groups. And so this is evidence of unfairness. And in fact, you could really calculate any sort of model performance metric, compare it between two or more groups, and use that as a definition of fairness. And in fact, I would say pretty much every cell of this confusion matrix here corresponds to some notion of fairness. So for example, this one here, positive predictive value. So I can't point because we're not in person, but it's the first row, maybe third column over, depending on your counting, maybe fourth, would say that of people who are, say, predicted to be rearrested in the future, the rate at which they actually are rearrested is the same between two groups. And that's, for example, another definition that people go by. You could also use a definition that's something like, okay, the accuracy of the model is the same for the groups, or as we just saw here, the false positive rates are the same between the groups. And some really interesting results that came about from this whole conversation in this area was that when the base rates between groups, so if the average rate of rearrest is different between two groups, then you can't have it all in terms of having the same performance metrics by group. So for example, you can't have equal false positive predictive values and equal false positive rates in that case. And there are sort of some other possibility there as well about this. All right. And so that's only one way of thinking about the fairness of the model in isolation. I would say that's probably the most popular, or it's been the one that's gotten the most attention in the sort of small world that I've been living in for the last several years. There's also individual fairness, which is essentially the idea that people who are similar should be treated similarly by the model. Now, the crux of this here is defining what similar means in this case, and that's entirely context specific and takes you out of the realm, in my opinion, of sort of like technical solutions and really makes you think very carefully about data and how you measure people. There are other ideas about using a single threshold. Here, the idea is you'd fit some model and classify everybody whose prediction falls above some threshold to be in one category, below that threshold to be in some other category. Sort of expanding on this idea, maybe I'm taking some liberties here, but I think really this idea is getting at the same procedure should be applied to all people. And there are also notions of causal fairness, which sort of outlines which types of relationships are acceptable within a predictive model based on making assertions about which sort of causal paths are acceptable in the real world. Okay, and again, this has been sort of the dominant paradigm, in my opinion, in thinking about algorithmic fairness over the last several years. This sort of general framework here of the model in isolation. Okay, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. And by the way, that wasn't really my work. That was just sort of an overview of where I see the field has been. I think, you know, when we sort of take a step back and think about the models, they aren't really ever used just in isolation. It's never just a model by itself. They're actually going to be used in practice. So I think if we want to be thinking more deeply about fairness, we also need to be thinking about the use of the model in practice. So this is an example of a project I did that I think illustrates some things you might want to think about in that case. So in this case, I'm talking about a project I did with some folks in San Francisco, looking at the impact of overbooking on a pretrial risk assessment model. So I already told you what a pretrial risk assessment model is. I don't need to do that again. But let me tell you a little bit something about the process that happens when someone's arrested. So the process, this is obviously, again, a cartoon version of it. An officer will make an arrest. Then they'll transport the person they've arrested, usually to the jail, where that officer will report the booking charges. These are essentially unvetted charges that are written down, sort of the justification for that person's detention at that time. Now, in San Francisco, within 48 hours, the district attorney's office would file charges. There'll be a second look at whether those charges are accurate or supported by at least the minimal evidence that's available at the time. But within 24 hours, one of these pretrial risk assessment models will be run on this person with the idea that they want to expedite the release of low-risk people. So anybody who, say, would end up in that green category on that second slide I showed you could be out the door within 24 hours. All right, but again, keep in mind these booking charges are just essentially what the officer says at the time. Okay, so what is overbooking then? I already mentioned that word. So essentially what I mean is booking a person who has been arrested on charges that are higher or more serious than warranted. And this is a little bit of a squishy definition here. So again, we have those booking charges. That's what the officer reports at the time of arrest. Then the person goes through the criminal legal process, and out the other side comes the charges that they are actually convicted of. Now, both of these I think are not perfect as a ground truth, but in this case, we're going to say the conviction charges are sort of the truth in this case, and we're going to say someone has been overbooked if those initial booking charges were significantly higher than what they are ultimately convicted of. The idea being that they were booked under charges for which there wasn't, that weren't ultimately substantiated by the criminal legal process. And there may be some problems with that definition, and we can come back to that in the Q&A if you'd all like. But I think it's sort of a reasonable place to start when talking about overbooking. And I said substantially higher, and I think it will become clear what I mean by substantially based on the context of what I'm talking about here in a minute. Okay. So again, sort of going back to this model, that this risk assessment model is actually used in San Francisco in this case. It's composed of a few different things. So we have these inputs over here on the left, criminal history and demographic information. Those go into two separate models. One's called the FTA, that's failure to appear risk model, and another is called a rearrest risk model, or NCA, new criminal activity. And these, again, are statistical models. They probably look fairly similar to things that many of us have seen in the past. So these two risk models, the predictions from these two models are combined to make an initial recommendation. Okay, and so you've already seen this picture here. So you would combine that FTA output, it's a 1 through 6 score, the NCA output also 1 through 6, and you'd end up in one of these squares. This is sort of the initial recommendation. Again, green is just let the person go, red is release not recommended, and yellow and orange fall in the middle. Okay. Another input to this process is also those booking charges that I mentioned. And those booking charges feed into a violence risk model. Again, basically something that predicts a binary outcome, 0, 1, yes, this person is likely to be rearrested for a violent crime, 0, no, that's called a violence flag because it's binary. Okay. So then those booking charges also get used at this next stage. And by the way, I don't mean to belabor the complexity of this model exactly, but it's just a little bit important to understand how these booking charges play into, or sort of are processed by this entire model if we want to understand, how we're going to evaluate the impact of the booking charges on the model itself. In any case, so those booking charges also go into this next stage, this exclusions and bump up stage, which takes in that initial recommendation, that green, yellow, orange, or red, that violence flag, that binary prediction from the statistical model, and these booking charges again. And so exclusions look something like this. It's essentially a not so complicated decision tree, or just a rule process. If any of the booking charges contain the following very serious sorts of crimes, then this person automatically gets moved all the way up to the red. It's called an exclusion because they're automatically not recommended for release. However, if the booking charges contain that violent flag, contain a violent charge and that violent flag is tripped, then we would also move that person up to that red category, release not recommended. Okay, there is another set of rules that are applied here, which I'm calling bump ups, which looks similar to the previous, except instead of moving the person all the way up to the release not recommended, the recommendation level is increased by 1. So if green moved to yellow, yellow moved to orange, orange moved to red. If red, well, you can't collapse to stay at red. And again, this looks very similar. So if the booking charges contain any of these following crimes on the left, then you would get the person to receive a bump up. And if the booking charges do not contain a violent charge and the violence flag is 1, then you would also bump up by 1. Okay, and then out the other end comes your final recommendation. That anything from just release the person to release not recommended. And I think an important thing to point out here is these things over on the left, each of these risk models are based on statistical models. Like at some point, a model was fit to data, which produces some sort of prediction based on a statistical model. Those exclusions and bump ups, to the best of my understanding, are more based on politics. So it's more the idea that these are things that it would be unacceptable to release someone for, and aren't directly tied to empirical estimates of risk directly. Okay. And so again, sort of coming back to the idea here, how we wanted to think about the use of this model in practice was we wanted to understand the role of overbooking, or the impact of overbooking on this model. And this project was dreamed up in collaboration with some folks at the Public Defender's Office in San Francisco. And so the plan for how we wanted to evaluate goes as follows, now that you understand how the model is used in practice. So we reproduced the risk assessment model. As you can see, it's really just kind of a complicated decision tree with some statistical models built into the front. And we had a sample of a bunch of people who were evaluated during a pilot program, and we run the model using the booking charges. So at the time that the person was booked, we used the exact charges that the police officer submitted at that time. And out the other side, just like we talked about, comes this recommendation. Then we waited 2 years, or actually not quite that long, so we got some data that had already, the data we had was from the time past, but 2 years after the initial data, we looked again and saw what charges that person was actually convicted of. And we reran the model using only those charges. In some cases, additional charges had been tacked on, and so if they'd been convicted of those in the meantime, those were also included. But essentially we reran this risk assessment model using the charges the person was convicted of rather than the charges that they were booked under in the beginning. And the plan here is we want to compare these recommendations. So if the recommendation based only on what the officer said at the time is higher than the recommendation that the person would have gotten only based on the charges that were ultimately substantiated by the criminal legal process, then we would say that that recommendation was impacted by overbooking. So the overbooking actually caused this model to issue a higher recommendation than it would have if it had access to information about what the person was actually convicted of. Now, to be fair, at the time, it won't ever have that information. And if every person were convicted of every charge that they were booked under, that would sort of subvert the whole point of the process here. But I think this is, again, a reasonable comparison to do. And so what we, if we're finding, for example, that booking charges are routinely causing this model to issue higher recommendations, then we might think that there's a problem that, that charges that are ultimately unsubstantiated by the court system are causing people to have poor treatment in the pretrial process. And so the data we had from this was from a pilot run of the PSA. So PSA stands for Public Safety Assessment. That was the model I just showed you, the somewhat complicated set of rules. It was about 2,000 cases processed during this pilot study in San Francisco. From the Public Defender's Office, we got individuals' names, unique IDs, arrest dates, and all of this booking charges. And then we ended up matching these to court records that we got, which were about 70,000 charges for everybody who touched the system during that same time period. And we were able to match on the individual's name, unique ID, arrest date. And from those court records, we actually got the outcome for every single charge. So we were able to determine, those final conviction charges in the end. And this is a fairly short version of the results. Again, if there's more questions in the Q&A, we can go into that in a little bit more depth. But what we found was that 27.4% of the cases that were evaluated during the pretrial period, during the pilot study, had a higher recommended level of supervision based only on charges that were ultimately unsubstantiated by the system. So between a quarter and a third, closer to a quarter of people who were evaluated by the model had that model say that they should receive more supervision, again, based only on charges that were proven in the court. We can also look at each of the sort of constituent parts of that model and see how this plays out using these two charts. So that one number I told you is the one circled in red. We can look at it for each of them. If we were to use conviction charges, for example, to calculate it, only 8.7% of people would have gotten an exclusion, whereas based on the booking charges, 29.4% got an exclusion. And so if you think back, this is something that actually surprised me. When I was, sort of conceiving of this project with my collaborators, they were, as public defenders, really concerned about the role of overbooking and how that kind of interacts in practice with the use of one of these models. And when I sort of started by looking through the list of charges that were on that, the sort of exclusions list, I really didn't expect there to be this large of a difference, right? Like you see that it's really extremely serious type of charges. At least my kind of naive view going into this was that it would be really rare for someone to actually be, say, charged with something like murder and have that not ultimately be convicted of that. But in fact, it seems to happen fairly routinely. Not necessarily murder, but the charges are high enough to trigger some of these exclusions or bump ups to the extent that they increase someone's pretrial supervision or recommendation for pretrial supervision, again, without ultimately being substantiated. Okay, so Again, I can go through some more results later if people are interested, but I think that's that was sort of the big takeaway, that 27.4%, which is much higher than I expected. All right, so this has to do with the use in practice again. So the use of embedded charges in the model opens the door, in my opinion, for gaming of the system. So in situations where there's wiggle room about which is the appropriate charge, one could elect the higher charge to induce a higher recommended level of supervision. So for example, if you're concerned about fairness in use, these are things one would need to think about. How can someone perhaps game the input data to get different results that you'd be expecting coming out the other side? It also has to do with accountability, which is another, I think, big issue when we start thinking about fair use of models. So I think increased accountability for those inputs is especially important if the inputs are in some way to be legitimized by their use in the model. And by legitimized, what I mean in this case is, if you have those charges and they haven't really been even gotten a second look yet at all, but then they're pushed through a model and out the other side comes something that says release not recommended or high risk or something like that. It might not be clear to the decision maker that the reason that label has been applied to a person is because of these charges that maybe aren't so supported, right? And so in some way that's legitimizing those charges because they're causing this thing to say high risk, and the person is in some way trusting that high risk in a way that they might not trust just sort of the raw charges on their own. Another important point here, I think, is that a model that is fair in isolation, so again, based on that first definition, looking at these sort of group-wise parity types of definitions, may not be used in a way that's consistent with fairness or justice in practice. So even if you do have, say, when you're evaluating the model in isolation, maybe you are able to achieve something like equal false positive rates. Then in practice, if people are, for example, trying to increase certain people's inputs in certain ways, those sorts of results might break down in practice going forward. Okay, and now I'm getting to my third level here, which has to do with the development of the model. So again, we've talked about thinking about fairness from the point of view of the model all by itself, now thinking about fairness and how it's actually going to be used. And now let's take a little bit of a step back and think about the importance of fairness in the model development process. And this, again, is another project I worked on a few years ago that has to do with retrial risk assessment. So this is a project I worked on in collaboration with some folks who built one of these models to be used in New York City. And the idea behind this risk assessment model was that it was to be used for determining eligibility and giving risk labels for a supervised release program. So if somebody was detained pre-trial, so they were still in jail, this model is run, and then if the person is in the highest risk group, they would not be eligible for entry into a supervised release program, so another way for them to get out of jail. But if they're in lower risk groups, they were. And so this risk assessment model was based on data from New York City between 2009 and 2011. Part of the results I'm not going to go into detail here about, but something that I think is really relevant to this problem is that was the height of stop and frisk in New York City. I'm sorry, my watch is ringing. So the outcome that they wanted to predict in this case was felony rearrest. And some of the justification for choosing felony rearrest as opposed to any rearrest was the idea that, well, because the data is sort of infected in some ways by racially biased policing during 2009, 2011, that perhaps if they focused only on predicting felony rearrest, that would eliminate that problem. All right, so features, covariates, et cetera, that went into this model were age of the individual warrants, whether they had any existing warrants, whether they had previous drug convictions, whether they had any previous felony convictions, whether it was their first arrest, whether they were employed or otherwise engaged in full-time activity, and whether the current arrest was for previous misdemeanor convictions, and whether they had any current open cases. And in this case, I'll go into a little bit more about how the model was developed. Okay, so the procedure that they did, and this is not that unusual, I think, relative to what I've seen for other risk assessment models that have been developed, goes as follows. So they fit a logistic regression. So logistic regression, where the outcome is that indicator of felony rearrest, the inputs or the covariates are each of those things I just mentioned. So then they find the smallest significant coefficient, so smallest in magnitude coefficient that is significant, so statistically significant at 0.05. They divide all the other coefficients by the smallest one and round coefficients to the nearest integer. So I'll sort of give an example of how this works in practice. So here is a cartoon example again. So you have each of these 4 variables here on the left in the variable column, and a logistic regression is run so that you're predicting that felony rearrest outcome. And suppose you get these coefficients here. So the warrants variable gets a 0.5 coefficient, the first arrest gets -1.5, et cetera. And each of these have associated p-values shown in the 3rd column over there. Okay, so then the next step would be to zero out the coefficients that are not significant. So that one that has the p-value of 0.1 would be zeroed out. And then from the ones that remain, find the one that is smallest in magnitude and divide the others by it and rescale. So in this case, that -0.4 would be the smallest in magnitude, but it wasn't significant, so we don't count it. Instead, we'll take the 0.5, which is the smallest remaining in magnitude coefficient that is significant, and we'll rescale. So that one is just 0.5 divided by 0.5, that's a 1, et cetera. The -1.5 divided by 0.5 is 3, et cetera. And then we would round each of those numbers to the nearest integers. The 1 becomes a 1, -3 becomes 3, and that -2, and the 2.5 becomes a 3, and 0 remains 0. Again, I'm sort of going into detail here, so you can see how this all plays out in practice. All right. And the reason that people do this is to people who are used to building predictive models, maybe that humans aren't going to be calculating on their fingers, this might seem a little bit strange, this sort of zeroing out and rescaling. The idea here is that they want people to be able to calculate these basically on their fingers, right? They want people to be able to look at them and understand, you know, where the final scores are coming from and how to calculate them. And so this is a common approach to doing that. Okay. So in this case, they applied that procedure I just described, that sort of logistic regression, rounding, dividing, rescaling, and rounding procedure to 3, what I call our chunks of the data. So an analysis data chunk, that's the randomly selected first half of the data, what they called validation data, that's the other half of the data, and then the union of those 2 things, which was all of the data together. And you get points associated with each of the features that as follows, so that's shown in this figure here. So if we use the analysis data, we get, say, 6 points for being age 16 to 19 and -3 points for being 40 or older. If we use the validation data, we get, for example, -5 points for being 40 or older. And if we use all the data, we'd get 9 points for being age 16 to 19 and -5 points for being 40 or older. And so at this point, I was a little bit stymied when I was sort of going through and trying to replicate the work. I was kind of confused because the final model that's actually used in practice is shown in that final column, the CJ reported column there. And I was unable to reproduce those numbers directly. At first, I thought they were likely coming from just using the validation set, but then I realized that didn't match on that age 40 or older. So I was really pretty confused about what was going on. And so I went back to the folks who built the model, and in conversations with them, determined that, one, I think it's been lost to history exactly why these decisions were made or how these decisions were made, but what it seems likely happened was that the model was fit on each of these chunks of data and then presented to the people who had commissioned the model, and they provided input on which of the point values made the most sense, or they preferred for each of the features, and those sort of ended up making the final point values. And as you can see, in most cases, it's not that different. Mostly for age, they can be, there is a little bit more variability here. But this is kind of, I think, for people who are, again, you know, thinking of modeling as maybe a more subjective, more objective exercise, or something that is purely scientific in nature, this seems sort of strange to go back and just sort of Frankenstein together these different pieces of these different sort of options for the point values and the criteria by which they're determining which were the appropriate or better ones. They're sort of lost to history again. So this -4 for age 40 and older doesn't really come from any of them. Maybe that is just taking an average for age 16 to 19. Well, maybe they thought 9 was too high, so 6. But again, this type of logic is kind of lost to the process. Okay, which this sort of made me curious about the question is, who did this type of hand selection benefit in this case? So what I did was I looked at the actual score that everybody got. So using the fourth column here, the actual model that's used in practice, what score were people given? And then what score would they have gotten if they had just taken the model from using all the data all together and just applied that rather than doing this sort of fiddling. And this is what I ended up finding. So if we were to disaggregate by age, we find that the scores tended to be, the actual scores tended to be lower for younger people. So that sort of hand fiddling benefited younger people. Again, so here, if the box plot shows a sort of lower center, that means the hand fiddling was more beneficial to that group relative to higher. And didn't have a whole lot of difference for older people. If we looked at the effect by race, it seems that this type of the decisions that were made about which point values to use mostly benefited relative to the total model, the model using just all the data together, Black people. And if we were to look at it by sex, it mostly benefited males. So largely, it seems that the decisions, these arbitrary-ish decisions, were made to benefit young Black men, which in the context of having data that is generated by stop and frisk kind of makes sense. At least to me, that makes sense to want to do some sort of adjustment. But the problem here is that the process is entirely opaque, and that you end up using a model. Often these sorts of models are promoted as being objective or more data-based, and in fact you have all of these very human decisions going into the process that have really substantial consequences for real people. Like, these scores are actually different for real people. Like, these sorts of decisions, at least hypothetically, move people from one risk group to another risk group, and not based on any sort of like direct model. It was just people making decisions about that. So I think what this sort of really points out is that when you're thinking about the model development process, we also need to be thinking about fairness there. So this is a really fairly obvious example about how these consequential human decisions are made that influence the outcome for real people. So even the models that are validated are based on statistical modeling, which this one in fact was. And whether you agree with the decisions made here or not, without safeguards in place, this process allows your people to invent nearly any set of rules and pass them off as data-driven or objective. And so this kind of brings up the question when we're thinking about creating models in ways that are fair, is who gets to decide how these decisions are made? Is that process fair? Who's at the table when someone's sitting there and saying, okay, we need to make these adjustments, or we need to make those adjustments? Or who's at the table when it's decided, okay, this level of predictive accuracy is acceptable for us to deploy the model versus this is not, or this level of, say, racial disparities, that's an acceptable amount, or this is not, or this is the right definition we should be looking at, or this one is not, right? All of these questions are really, really important, and I think they're kind of underlooked in thinking about fairness in the model in general when we're talking about quantitative models. The other thing that I think is important to be thinking about is who is involved in even building the model. Even once you get to the point of evaluation or making even these sorts of decisions, there are a ton of decisions that are made along the way that get kind of buried. So data processing decisions, the really sort of like boring but important work of data science, right? Like data munging. How do you process, say, number of past arrests? Are you going to throw out all the past arrests for things that have been decriminalized? That's a reasonable thing to do, or are you not? And again, who's involved in making those decisions and how are those decisions made? I think are really important considerations when trying to be more fair about how models are developed. Okay, and so finally, I have one final little bit here, and this is about fairness in problem formulation. So this is fairly brief. This is some things I've been thinking about and are published in a review article about algorithmic fairness in annual reviews this past year. But often as statisticians, machine learners, data scientists, when we get a problem, some of the things about that problem may seem out of scope, right? So there's all sorts of things that maybe seem like they're kind of handed down, but in fact are probably some of the most important things one should consider when thinking about whether the model is going to contribute to fairness, justice, social good, etc. So one thing to be thinking about is the overarching goal of the model. So is the overarching goal of the model fair or just? When we're talking about models used for my running example, this sort of pretrial risk assessment model, it sort of depends on who you ask. For some people, it's just helping people make better decisions about people's risk. For others, these are tools for reducing pretrial detention. And yet for others, I think people see these as ways of making an existing unjust system more efficient. And so I think, there's a whole spectrum of where people fit, where people find themselves and how they relate to these models and how they think they're being used. But, what is your overarching goal, and is that goal fair or just itself, and how does this model support it? I think another thing to be asking is, does predicting some small set of outcomes serve this goal? So often you might have some type of goal, like I said, maybe it's reducing pretrial detention, and you might think, but then when it comes time to build a model, it comes down to the way we're going to do that is predict this thing, say rearrest, which is a very sort of like the scope is sort of collapsing around this one very specific predictive task. And I find that often when you have a predictive hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I think, again, asking that question of how does this small set of outcomes serve this goal, if you decide for yourself that the overarching goal of even building the model in the first place is something that is fair or just, or in the benefit of social good. Another thing that may seem out of scope is the decision space. So in this case, these models are used to make recommendations about people. Some of those recommendations, for example, are that the release is not recommended. Now, if you take the view that the criminal justice system is itself, or the conditions within pretrial detention, the conditions within a jail are themselves an unjust or inhumane way to treat a person, then some aspect of even the treatment this model could dole out to a person may not feel fair or just to you. And so thinking carefully about what is the decision space, if some of the outcomes that will be recommended or some of the actions that will be taken as a result of the model are themselves not fair or just, well, then that is also a problem if you want to build a model that supports those ideas. And again, if not even a model that behaves fairly in isolation, may not serve fairness and justice. So for example, if this is getting away from my pretrial risk assessment model example, to be clear, but suppose you had a model that is just a random number generator that completely randomly generates an action for a person, and one of those actions is, say, cut off their hand, right? That would be fair by many of those sort of fairness metrics. It wouldn't really, everyone would have an equal chance of getting it, but I don't think anyone would say that that's a just or good thing to do, and would certainly not create a better world. Another thing to really be thinking of are the axes of fairness. So in many of the cases here, I've talked about disaggregating and thinking about impacts differentially by race. But race isn't the only thing to think about. You might also want to think about things like race or gender, or maybe race and gender, the intersection of those, or maybe race, gender, and disability, or maybe race, gender, disability, and homelessness status. All of these sorts of things are important, and it's really not a given which sort of dimensions or axes along which one should be evaluating whether the model is behaving fairness, and even determining which are the sort of sensitive attributes or protected attributes for your particular case, I think should go through a process that itself is in some sense representative or incorporating a variety of different voices. I should note that in some cases, the sort of protected attributes are already defined by law. And so that might be a place to start, but I think that's not a place to end. That's just really a place to start. And finally, I'll end here with alternative solutions. So is a predictive model the best or only path towards this overarching goal that if you're moving forward with building a model that you support? In many cases, there may be, say, non-technical, maybe legislative, maybe policy approaches that may be just as effective and may have different downsides relative to a predictive model. And so thinking carefully about how a predictive model works or sort of interacts with other types of solutions, maybe as a substitute, maybe as something that interacts and helps those solutions, or maybe just don't do it at all and leave the other solutions if they're better. sort of thinking through all of these things when you're even formulating the problem, again, sort of, making sure that there's fairness in how the problem is conceived of, how that decision space is defined, which sorts of axes of fairness are considered, which sorts of alternative solutions are considered, and even what is the overarching goal, like who's determining that, I think is also an important component of all of this. All right. And so I'll close down here by saying thank you to my colleagues who contributed to various pieces of this work. So the project having to do with overbooking was in collaboration with Megan Price and Shesa Boudin. The second one, looking at reproducing the model that's used in New York, was in collaboration with Tarek Shah. So Megan and Tarek were my colleagues at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. Shesa was my colleague at San Francisco Public Defender's Office. He is now the District Attorney of San Francisco. And the final four down here, Sharon Mitchell, Eric Potash, Solon Barocas, and Alex Zamore, worked with me on the review article where we thought through many of the different considerations that go into building a model that aren't necessarily the sort of technical components of it. And so with that, I will open it up to questions, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lum. I wanted to put this link in the chat too. I don't know if you saw this, but the National Institute of Justice just started basically a Kaggle competition for predicting recidivism, which I thought was interesting. I think it might make a good data set for anyone who's teaching in this space or who wants to learn more. I have to say, I particularly like the emphasis on that question of who's at the table. That really is one of the defining things in this space, and it's why we want to encourage representation in data science so much when those decisions are being made. Does anyone have any direct questions? Can you talk a little bit, or do you know about the differences between the federal system for predicting recidivism and the state systems? Because I understand a lot of these prediction algorithms operate at the state level. Is it true that the federal government has a much more robust and thorough exploration of people's lives before deciding these factors?
I will admit that most of the ones I've looked at are more state level. So I've currently been looking at one from Kentucky. The one in New York was actually city level, and San Francisco is also city level. The other thing that's interesting is that the PSA, one of the models that I presented in the overbooking one, is used all across the country. It's the same model everywhere, and so there's a whole lot of variability, even at the jurisdiction level, like city by city, relative to whole state. In Kentucky, it's the whole state. But it's really hard to generalize. In some places like New York City, where they have the resources, they have a kind of bespoke model, a homegrown model that's made just from their data, et cetera. And so again, it's a little bit hard to generalize. What I'm familiar with in the federal system is a model called Pattern. And what I found interesting about that one is that there is a lot of information about, similar to what we saw here, what the points are associated with each of the factors that go into it. Then you sort of go down and you're like, okay, what is this factor? And some of the factors themselves are the outputs of other models, which are themselves proprietary. And so it's sort of these models all the way down where you're like, okay, well, this part seems fairly transparent and I can understand what's going on. Then you get to this next layer and you're like, I don't even know, where would this input even come from? And without access to it, you can't know. And so I get given that's the only thing in the federal system I've looked into, and I actually don't even know what's going into those sort of subsidiary models that are feeding into the bigger one that there is information about. It's hard for me to say whether it's more to even do a comparison, right? It's hard to say.
So that leads me to my next question, which just completely evaporated from my brain as I was saying that sentence, which is funny. That's just.
Well, that's okay. It happens. Zoom fatigue happens to everybody.
Yeah, it really does. Oh, I got it. So another speaker was talking about these adverse action notices and how people can, demand an answer from credit reporting companies as to maybe why their credit was denied or something like that. Is there anything anywhere that you've heard of where people can demand the same type of information for why they are behind bars?
Right. So I think that's a great question. And there are some kind of like layers to that as well. So in these cases, with the exception of the one I've seen in New York City, where it literally does determine eligibility for that supervised release program, usually there is a human standing between the model's predictions and that person's outcome. So it's really just, in most cases, something that makes a recommendation or makes a sort of additional information to a human who then incorporates that into their whatever complex decision-making process they're doing. And so even in that case, it's hard to say, causally why that person is, say, incarcerated or detained, because there is that human in the middle, right? Like it's not just the model, it's really not just the human, it's probably some combination of them. So there was one case, I believe in Wisconsin, Loomis was, I think, the name on it, where this person sued to get more information about the proprietary model that was used. I need to look up the details of that. In most cases, so this idea that like it should be transparent is actually kind of trying to address, I think, one of the things that you're getting at here. So in the third example I gave, where you can actually count up the points on your fingers, I think that is a lot of the reasoning behind wanting to do something like that, right? So that someone, if they can say, okay, well, I got 2 points for being, like, say, young, for example, well, I can actually verify that myself. There's few factors that are going into it, and they're not really interacting in complicated ways. So I don't even really need a computer in front of me to understand, like, okay, but what if we didn't count this past rearrest? Like, would that change my score substantially? And so, I think for the models that are more complicated, and there are some that are more complicated, for example, in Philadelphia, I believe there's one used by probation and parole that is random forest space, at least that's what I've heard. You actually would need, a lot more access, but for some of these other types of models that are specifically designed to be fairly simple and interpretable to humans, I think that is, at least addresses some of that issue.
And can you get access to the data that went in? You still have no right to the whatever database is used.
No. Oh, no. I mean, yes and no. If you have the right connections and you are willing to, say, wait a year to get data sharing access, and you know how to put in the right requests, you in some cases can get data. But that's actually interesting. So in the New York case that I was talking about, where they kind of took the different pieces of the model, then kind of pushed it together in some way. What's really interesting about that process took me a fairly long time to get the data. I was working with the New York Legal Aid Society, and they were sort of supporting my effort to get the data, so that helped quite a bit. As a public defender, one of the public defender organizations in New York City. But one of the terms of getting that data was that after I was done doing this analysis, it had to be destroyed, which is something I think that's fairly common in IRPs, right? Like after you're done with the data, you need to destroy it. But also the agency that made the tool had to destroy it as well. And so again, sort of talking about all the sort of pre-processing steps that go into making a data set like that, I can't imagine we'll ever be able to, even if we had access, could recompile like pull the raw data set from the database itself. All these decisions, how are you even counting up past arrest? How are you counting this? How are you combining all of these different things? Having done this a few times at this point, it does get fairly complicated. There are all kinds of decisions. Are you going to count this but not that? Are you going to, where are the failures to appear recorded? They're in the bonds database. Is this bond account is associated with this one or not associated? There's all these decisions. We're never going to be able to reproduce that data set. So now what we have is a model that's used in practice, again, to make consequential decisions about people's lives. And that's just gone. There's no way to go back and backtrack and figure out, sort of get at even a more core issue. So what you were talking about is, okay, why, sort of conditional on the model existing is my recommendation this. But if you want to go back a step deeper than that, which is I think what you're suggesting, and say, okay, well, why is that point value even that? Why is this one weighted so high? Well, that's not even possible anymore.
Yeah, or even just what is your record of my data to make sure it's correct, right? To make sure there's no typos that went into.
Mm-hmm.
incarcerated, which I know has happened. There's a couple of questions here in the chat too. From Clara, I was thinking of your example of cutting off hands fairly. How do you see the role of models shaping policy, especially in a situation like bail and parole, where the judges make decisions without models are not necessarily fair either, and we're sending people into an unfair system?
I think this is the big question, right? Like, I think it's a question that a lot of us are grappling with who are working in the criminal justice space. And I mean, I don't think anyone would say that judges are going to behave perfectly fairly either. And so I think it's often sort of, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Clara, but it's often sort of pitted as either it's the model or it's the judge. And those are sort of the only two options we have if we want to reform the system. But in fact, I think there are a lot of other levers. So for example, New York had some legislation a couple years ago, a year and a half ago, I guess, where they sort of legislated which types of, again, booking charges, I imagine, but which types of crimes are even eligible for pretrial detention. And so they also had a risk assessment model involved in that, but there's this sort of like blunter instrument of saying like, okay, just based on not risk, not predictions on anything like that, maybe moral, ethical judgments, we think anybody who's only been charged with something up to this, just they shouldn't even be eligible, right? And so absolutely, I think, judges aren't going to be behaving perfectly fairly. They're human, just like all of us are. The data itself is going to embed human biases, human problems. It's going to be, it's recorded in a society that has all sorts of fairness issues itself. Models learn those same problems, reproduce those same patterns. But I think also it's important to, to remember that it's not always like status quo or this model. Like there are many things in between and in fact beyond those two options.